the winter of 1843, the quiet heart of North Carolina's Blue Ridge Mountains trembled with whispers of something unimaginable. It began, as most scandals do, not with a crime, but with a union that defied every rule both God and man had written. Two men, joined by flesh and fate, married two sisters, and in doing so, tore open the boundaries of what a community believed was humanly possible. The men were Chang and Eng Bunker, the world-renowned conjoined twins once displayed as wonders of creation. The Siamese twins, whose fame had spread from London to New York. But fame is a cage of its own kind. By their late 20s, the brothers had grown weary of being spectacles, of physicians who poked at their joined bodies and crowds who paid to gawk. They bought their freedom and sought peace in a place where no one would stare. Surry County, North Carolina, a land of tobacco fields, winding dirt roads, and God-fearing people who lived and died within sight of the same mountains. To the locals, the Bunkers were a curiosity wrapped in fine suits. Foreign-born, soft-spoken, and rich enough to own land and slaves, they unsettled the rigid rhythms of a place where every soul was supposed to look, act, and pray the same. But money carried weight, even in the Blue Ridge. Slowly the community tolerated them, if never truly embraced them. Then came the act that shattered that fragile tolerance. The twins began to court two local sisters, Adelaide and Sarah Yates, daughters of a struggling farmer. It was whispered first as a joke, then as an obscenity. How could two men joined at the chest pursue two women? How could such a marriage exist? And yet, when the twins formally asked for the sisters' hands, David Yates could not refuse. The Bunkers offered his daughters financial security, something love alone could never guarantee in a hard land. Their double wedding took place quietly in April of 1843, with few witnesses and no public notice. Two men, forever joined, married two sisters who would share not just husbands but a single intertwined fate. Within months, both wives were expecting children, their pregnancies announced almost in unison, as though even their wombs had begun to mirror the strange symmetry of the men they married. The town of White Plains recoiled. What had begun as fascination now curdled into fear. In a place built on clear lines, between man and woman, husband and wife, natural and unnatural, those lines had been crossed, blurred, erased. The Bunkers had not merely defied society, they had redefined it. And as their family began to grow, so too did the dread of a community that could no longer decide whether it was witnessing a miracle of nature or a quiet, living horror. By the summer of 1844, the Bunker plantation had become the strangest household in all of North Carolina. What had once been idle curiosity had now hardened into a sense of unease that settled over Surry County like low mountain fog. The Bunkers were no longer a traveling exhibition. They had rooted themselves in the soil of the Blue Ridge, and that somehow made their existence more unsettling. Adelaide and Sarah Yates Bunker, once inseparable sisters, now found themselves bound in an arrangement that challenged both affection and sanity. The first months of marriage had been awkward enough. Meals shared in forced civility, nights divided by routine and rotation, and two women learning to live with the unnerving reality that their husbands could never truly be apart. Yet by the time the twins' first children were born, Adelaide's in February, Sarah's just days later, something darker began to take hold. Neighbors whispered that the births were a sign of divine disapproval, or worse, proof that the unnatural union had cursed the mothers. The timing of their pregnancies, so eerily synchronized, fed those rumors like dry wood to a fire. For the twins, it was the beginning of a long descent into quiet torment. Life in the Bunker household settled into a strange symmetry. Two wives, two sets of children, two homes, built side by side yet divided by more than distance. When the Bunkers first married, both families shared the same house, a sprawling two-story structure where every meal and every glance became an unspoken contest. Adelaide accused Sarah of stealing more affection from Ang than Chang could ever offer her. Sarah claimed Adelaide was favored by the community because her husband was the more outspoken and daring of the two. Their rivalry grew like a creeping vine, silent at first, then suffocating. By 1848, unable to endure the tension, the brothers made a fateful decision. They built a second house a short ride away, facing one another across a field. Each wife would govern her own household, raise her own children, and claim her half of the Bunker world. The twins, still joined at the sternum, would spend 3 days in one home, then 3 in the other. It was a compromise born of desperation, and one that turned their lives into a living experiment. Sheriff William Gilmer, who patrolled the region, began hearing strange reports. Workers spoke of children who never crossed from one yard to the other, of laughter that turned to silence when the brothers arrived, and of hymns sung at midnight by a lonely wife waiting for her turn. Those who visited described the air as heavy, like a house holding its breath. Yet there was no crime to investigate, no blood, no theft, no sin that law could name. What disturbed the sheriff most was not what he could see, but what he could feel, a quiet unraveling of human nature itself. The Bunkers had sought to build ordinary lives. Instead, they had created something the county would remember as a living ghost story, a family divided not by distance, but by the impossibility of being whole. By the winter of 1852, Sheriff William Gilmer had come to dread the name Bunker. In the mountains of Surrey County, where most disputes were settled with a handshake or a sermon, the Bunker household was a problem no badge could solve. There was no bloodshed, no theft, no violence, just a feeling that something unnatural was unfolding behind those shuttered windows. The first man to bring him word of it was a seasonal farmhand. He sat stiffly in the sheriff's office one December morning, hat twisting in his hands, describing a place where the air felt wrong. He spoke of children who watched each other from separate yards, as though invisible chains kept them apart. He claimed one of the wives sang hymns late into the night when the twins were staying at the other home, her voice echoing across the fields like a mourning dove lost in fog. The man said he'd quit not because of poor pay, but because he could no longer bear the silence. A few months later, another account reached Gilmer. A governess hired to teach the younger Bunker children lasted only 3 weeks before fleeing back to town. She described a divided kingdom, where 2 queens ruled separate courts, neither willing to acknowledge the other. Meals were solemn, conversation brief, and the children, though polite, seemed watchful, like they understood their family existed under a cloud of judgment. 2 of the children, she noted, were deaf and mute. It's as if the house itself swallowed their voices, she told the sheriff before leaving town for good. Gilmer began riding past the Bunker properties during his patrols. He never approached directly. There was no reason to intrude. Yet what he saw troubled him. 2 houses stood on opposite hillsides, one painted white, the other a pale gray, like reflections in a mirror gone slightly wrong. Smoke rose from one chimney for 3 days, then the other, depending on where the twins stayed. The alternating rhythm of life continued with eerie precision, 6 days in a week, split evenly between 2 homes, one restless body carrying 2 hearts that beat out of sync. To outsiders, it was a curiosity. To Gilmer, it looked like slow disintegration disguised as order. He wrote in his private journal, "They are men of good conduct and sound industry, but they live as though cursed to test the limits of human patience. The women are fading in spirit. The children, quiet as tombs." The sheriff's instincts told him he was watching a family unspool thread by thread. But what could he do? There was no law for unnatural arrangements. The church whispered of sin. The town whispered of madness. And Gilmer, a man of reason, began to understand that some horrors wear no criminal face. They simply erode the soul in plain sight. In the Blue Ridge that winter, smoke still rose from 2 chimneys, alternating like a heartbeat trying to keep time with itself. The Bunkers had built 2 houses to preserve peace, but all they'd really built was a mirror of human suffering, perfectly divided. When the first shots of the Civil War echoed through the Carolinas in 1861, most men in Surrey County felt the call of duty as a matter of pride. But for the Bunker twins, war was not a summons they could answer. 2 men joined by flesh could not march as one soldier. Eng wanted to serve the Confederacy. Chang did not. It was one of the few times they openly quarreled, their voices rising in the narrow room they shared like thunder trapped beneath the same roof. Their wives heard every word. Adelaide feared losing her husband to the cause. Sarah in secret prayed that he might go. The twins' dispute lasted 3 days and 3 nights, ending only when Eng fell into fever and Chang refused to let him rise from the bed. In the end, neither enlisted. The war passed them by, yet somehow it invaded their home all the same. Supplies grew scarce. The hired hands left for battle or fled the county. One of the bunker houses went cold, its hearth dark for months as the family crowded into the other. Children grew thin. Adelaide's eldest boy came down with fever and died before spring. The local doctor wrote in his ledger, "A most curious case, death by exhaustion of the mother's mind." As the fighting raged farther south, strangers began appearing on back roads near the plantation. Deserters, raiders, the lost and hungry. Once a group of soldiers stopped at the bunker property demanding food. When Sarah stepped out to reason with them, they laughed and called her a witch for the strange pair of men behind her. The twins did not respond. They stood in silence, joined at the ribs, until one soldier muttered, "Best leave the devil's house alone." The men rode off without another word. Sheriff Gilmer, older now and tired, continued to check on them from a distance. He saw the land fall to ruin, the fences broken, the fields unplanted, the children grown pale and cautious. The war had consumed most of North Carolina, but the bunkers seemed caught in a different kind of battle, one between endurance and despair. When peace finally returned, it brought no relief. The county had changed. The world had grown smaller, and stories of the Siamese farmers had turned the family into a sideshow curiosity once more. The twins accepted invitations to travel again, hoping to restore their fortune, but the wives refused to go. Adelaide and Sarah remained behind, each in her half of the empty property, living out their days as widows who were never truly alone. In his final journal entry, Sheriff Gilmer wrote, "I have seen many oddities in man's nature, but none like the bunkers. Two men chained not by sin nor crime, but by the cruel hand of birth, and through them, 4 souls condemned to live one tangled life." The war had ended, but in Surry County, the bunker story became a legend, a reminder that some battles are fought not on fields, but in the fragile chambers of the human heart. By the autumn of 1874, the Bunker twins had become living relics. Their faces, once the talk of every county fair from Boston to New Orleans, were now carved deep with age and sorrow. Chang's hair had turned white, Eng's only slightly less so, and yet their eyes, those same alert, watchful eyes that had once charmed audiences and unsettled strangers, still mirrored the same weary defiance. Their wives, Adelaide and Sarah, had long since passed. Adelaide first in '68, her death quiet and sudden. Sarah followed 2 winters later, found in her rocker near the cold hearth, hands folded as though still waiting for something that never came. Their children, those few who survived the war and sickness, had moved west, ashamed or perhaps exhausted by the name they carried. The great Bunker farm stood silent, its fields turned to thistle and sumac. Only the twins remained. They no longer performed, no longer wrote letters to agents or showmen. The world had moved on to new spectacles, railroads, telegraphs, machines that could carry voices across wires. What crowd would pay to see 2 tired old men joined at the chest? Yet in Surry County their legend endured. Children dared each other to wander near the old bunker place after dark. Farmers claimed to see lanterns moving through the fog, 2 shadows walking in perfect step, never speaking. In January of 1874, Chang fell ill after a winter storm. Eng tried to tend to him, refusing rest. The doctor who came from Mount Airy could do nothing. Pneumonia had set in too deep. On the morning of January 17th, Chang Bunker took his final breath. His brother, still awake beside him, begged him to hold on, but within minutes, Chang's pulse went still. Witnesses later said Eng's face changed completely. He refused to accept what had happened, insisting his brother was only sleeping. He poured water to his lips, called for a priest, tried to move their shared arm. But death has a weight no living man can bear. By dawn, Eng's heart slowed too, matching the silence beside him. They were buried together, of course. How could it be otherwise? The county built a single casket, wide enough for 2, and laid them in the red clay of White Plains Baptist Churchyard, the same ground where their wives already slept. The stone reads simply, Chang and Eng Bunker, bound in life, bound in death. Sheriff Gilmer, long retired, attended the burial. He stood by the grave with trembling hands, the last man alive who remembered them not as wonders, but as neighbors. They tried, he whispered to no one. God knows they tried. As the mourners left, the wind rolled down from the Blue Ridge Hills, scattering dry leaves across the twin mound. And for a moment, just a moment, The sound that rose through the bare trees could almost have been laughter. Or perhaps it was just the echo of two hearts, still beating in time, somewhere beyond the reach of man. Years after the twin grave at White Plains was sealed, the story of Chang and Eng Bunker did not fade, it multiplied. In the quiet towns scattered across North Carolina's foothills, people spoke their names with a mixture of pity and awe. To the old, it was a story of faith and endurance. To the young, it became a fireside ghost tale, a whispered dare told under the hush of winter nights. The Bunker children who moved west rarely spoke of their fathers. Some settled in Tennessee, others in Alabama or Missouri. Yet every so often, a letter would arrive in Surry County, postmarked from distant towns, asking after the property, the graves, the legend. The answers never changed. The land was overgrown. The farmhouse collapsed in a storm sometime in the 1880s. By then, only the foundation stones remained, half buried in the grass like ribs beneath the skin of the earth. In 1887, a traveling journalist from New York arrived, hoping to write a feature about the conjoined farmers of Carolina. He interviewed locals, visited the churchyard, and stood for a long time before the shared headstone. His article, published that winter, described the twins not as curiosities but as men who lived without malice, who bore the weight of their difference with a dignity the world seldom returned. It was one of the few accounts that treated them kindly. But the world preferred the stranger version, the freak show myth, the sideshow tale. By the turn of the century, their descendants began to reclaim the story. A few grandchildren organized a family gathering in Mount Airy, where they spoke openly of their ancestors' courage. It was said that one of them brought an old Bible, its cover cracked and faded, the inscription inside reading, "Bound by birth, not by choice, yet faithful until death." Even so, the legend refused to die quietly. Locals swore that on misty mornings, when the fog crawled down from the Blue Ridge, you could still hear footsteps moving in perfect rhythm near the ruins of the old homestead. Some said it was the sound of the twins walking together, still tending their land. Others insisted it was only the wind through hollow wood, but no one lingered long enough to find out. By 1900, Surry County had grown, the railway cut through the hills, and progress swept away the last traces of the Bunker farm. But the story lingered in the soil, in the church bell that tolled every January for reasons no one remembered. Children still left wildflowers on the twin grave without knowing the tale behind it. In the end, the Bunkers became more than men. They became a parable, a lesson carved into the heart of the Blue Ridge itself, that some lives are joined not by choice, but by destiny, and that love, no matter how divided, seeks always to endure. And when the fog drifts low across Surry County, the old folks still say you can feel it, the weight of two souls, still walking side by side, bound forever in the hush between one heartbeat and the next. By the dawn of the 20th century, America had changed beyond recognition. Steam had given way to electricity, carriages to railroads, and the quiet back roads of Surry County were now crossed by telegraph lines humming with invisible energy. Yet in that rush toward modernity, one story from the Blue Ridge refused to vanish, the story of Chang and Eng Bunker. Historians began to rediscover them, combing through faded journals, newspaper clippings, and court records that told of the Siamese brothers who became Southern gentlemen. Their names appeared in university lectures, medical journals, and traveling exhibitions. Most painted them as marvels of anatomy, curiosities of science, but none captured the quiet humanity that had marked their lives. It would take nearly a century for the world to see them not as specimens, but as men. In 1910, a young scholar named Thomas Gilmer, grandson of the old sheriff, visited the ruins of the Bunker homestead. The fields were wild now, full of sumac and pine saplings, but the earth still held traces of furrows once plowed by four hands working in unison. Thomas wrote in his journal, "It feels as though they never left, as though the land itself remembers the rhythm of their footsteps." He spent the next decade gathering stories from aging residents, midwives, preachers, and farmers who still recalled the twins' quiet endurance. From those fragments, he compiled a manuscript titled "Bound in Flesh, Divided in Spirit." It was never published in his lifetime, but copies of his notes would later be cited by historians seeking to understand the emotional weight behind the myth. By the 1930s, their descendants numbered in the hundreds. They gathered once again in Mount Airy, not to mourn but to celebrate. A faded portrait of the twins was placed on a wooden podium draped in black and white ribbon. A great-grandson, a preacher from Georgia, spoke words that silenced the crowd. The world saw them as a wonder. But we remember them as fathers, men who tried, who loved, and who worked until love and labor became one. Over time, the world's fascination softened into respect. Museums stopped calling them freaks. Historians called them pioneers of perseverance. Even physicians studying conjoined twins began to reference the Bunkers not as a case, but as a legacy. Today, the Bunker descendants number in the thousands, spread across the United States. Many still visit the quiet grave at White Plains. They leave flowers, sometimes two at a time, always side by side. And each year, on the anniversary of their passing, a small crowd gathers under the same oak trees where the sheriff once stood, listening to the wind move through the hills like a slow, steady heartbeat. No marble monument stands for them. They need none. Their story endures in every whispered legend, every echo of footsteps on the misted ground, every reminder that even the most divided souls can live and die as one. In the end, history gave them what life did not: peace. By the middle of the 20th century, the Bunker twins had crossed that fragile line between history and folklore. Their names appeared in textbooks, their portraits hung in museums, and yet in Surrey County, they were spoken of the way one might speak of the weather, familiar, inevitable, and strangely alive. The churchyard where they rested became a place of quiet pilgrimage. Travelers stopped on their way through the Blue Ridge to lay flowers, to leave coins, to trace the carved words with their fingertips. Bound in life, bound in death. No epitaph ever said so much with so little. Locals swore the ground around their graves stayed warm even in winter. Old women said snow never lingered there long. The young laughed at the superstition, but few ever tested it twice. In 1952, a team of doctors from Duke University requested permission to exhume the twins' remains for study. The county refused. "Let them rest," the chairman said. They were studied enough in life. The decision was final. The earth would keep its secret. That refusal marked a turning point. For the first time, the world began to see the Bunkers not as curiosities to be examined, but as men whose lives deserve silence. By the 1970s, descendants had begun restoring what was left of the family's memory. One of them, a schoolteacher named Mary Bunker, gathered oral histories from elderly relatives and local families. Her tapes, full of crackling voices and long pauses, captured a truth no scientist ever could: the sound of love persisting through pain. She ended each recording with the same words: "They weren't born to be pitied. They were born to remind us that love endures where logic fails." The farmhouse foundation still lay beneath the soil, but now wild azaleas bloomed where the walls once stood. A small wooden marker was placed there in 1981 by local historians. It read, "On this ground stood the home of Chang and Eng Bunker, farmers, husbands, fathers, nothing more, nothing less." In the modern day, their descendants gather every few years, not in mourning but in quiet pride. Some are doctors, teachers, artists, even soldiers. All share the same story: the legacy of two men who refused to live as less than whole. Tourists who visit Surrey County sometimes ask the locals for directions to the old graveyard. The old men at the general store usually smile and point toward the hills. "You'll find it easy," they say. "Just follow the road till you feel like you've already been there once." And maybe they're right. Maybe the Bunkers never left those hills. Maybe they walk still, two souls bound by birth, by faith, by an understanding that unity is not the absence of difference, but the endurance of it. History wrote them as a curiosity. Time remembered them as men, and the wind, still moving through the Blue Ridge pines, whispers their names together, soft, inseparable, eternal. More than a century after their passing, the story of Chang and Eng Bunker lives on, not in sideshows or medical journals, but in classrooms, documentaries, and the hearts of their descendants. What began as a spectacle in the 1830s has become a symbol of endurance and humanity that still defies time. In the early 2000s, a group of historians from Wake Forest University began digitizing the surviving records: letters, photographs, and the few pages of the family Bible that survived the years. Their goal was simple: to restore the bunker's humanity in a world that once stripped it away. The archive, titled Bound Together: The Bunker Legacy, now sits online, free for anyone to see. The first line of its introduction reads, "This is not a story of anomaly. It is a story of grace." Filmmakers soon followed. Documentaries aired on PBS and the History Channel, tracing the brothers' journey from Siam to Surrey County. The footage lingered on the fog of the Blue Ridge, on the headstone weathered by time, and on the faces of modern descendants who spoke of pride, not shame. One, a young artist named Daniel Bunker, painted a series called Two Shadows, One Sun, now displayed in a North Carolina museum. The painting showed two figures standing in a single pool of light, one slightly ahead of the other, both fading into gold. Medical researchers, too, revisited the twins' story, not out of morbid curiosity, but to understand how two hearts, two minds, could coexist in one body for 62 years. Their bond, one doctor wrote in a 2014 study, is proof that survival is not only a biological act, but a human one. The same study concluded that their cooperation defied all recorded expectations of conjoined life. In Surrey County, the legend remains personal. Every January, the church bell at White Plains still tolls twice at dawn, a tradition with no official record, kept alive only by habit and reverence. Locals say it rings for both brothers, calling their spirits home through the fog. On clear nights, visitors sometimes gather at the cemetery, candles flickering in the cold air. They stand before the single stone and listen, not for voices, but for silence. Because in that silence, they say, you can feel something vast and ancient, not sorrow, not fear, just peace. Today, more than 1,500 descendants of Chang and Eng live across America. They are doctors, teachers, soldiers, and farmers. Ordinary people bound by an extraordinary heritage. None of them carry the burden of spectacle. Instead, they carry the quiet truth the world once refused to see, that two men, joined by fate, lived not as curiosities but as proof of the unbreakable will of the human spirit. The world remembers them now not as the Siamese twins, but as Chang and Eng Bunker, fathers, brothers, and men who refused to be divided. And so, beneath the whispering pines of Surrey County, their story continues, part history, part myth, and entirely human. Night falls softly over the Blue Ridge Mountains. Mist drifts low across the valleys, and the last light fades behind the Carolina pines. Somewhere near the old White Plains Baptist Church, the wind moves through the grass like breath through memory. Here, beneath a single stone carved with two names, rest the brothers who spent their lives defying the boundaries of body and soul, Chang and Eng Bunker. In death, they are no longer watched, no longer whispered about. The noise of the world has fallen silent around them. But if you listen closely, you might still hear the faint echo of two heartbeats, one that never truly stopped when the other did. History remembers them for what they were. The first, the famous, the strange. Yet beyond the spectacle lies something deeper, something almost sacred. Theirs is not a story about deformity or curiosity, but about endurance. It is the story of men who spent every waking moment in negotiation, with each other, with their wives, with the cruel curiosity of a world that could not decide whether to admire or pity them. The earth around their graves has changed. The plantation fields are gone now, replaced by quiet roads and weathered barns. The tobacco rows have become meadows where deer move through tall grass. The two homes the brothers built no longer stand, their foundations swallowed by time. Only the stone remains, its inscription fading, but its meaning eternal. Every generation that passes adds another layer to their legend. To some, they are symbols of unity. To others, a cautionary tale of obsession and the price of normalcy. But to those who walk among their descendants, they are remembered simply as family. Fathers who tried, brothers who endured, men who loved as best they could within the impossible limits of their shared existence. There are no villains here, no monsters, no miracles. Just two lives intertwined in a way that neither science nor society could ever fully comprehend. When they were born in Siam, no one imagined they would shape the language itself, that the word Siamese twins would echo through centuries. Yet the word is too small, too cold for what they truly were. They were not a curiosity. They were a covenant between flesh and will, between despair and hope. And perhaps that is the quiet truth that time leaves behind. That even the most extraordinary lives seek only what we all seek: belonging, peace, and the right to be seen as human. As dawn returns to Surrey County, mist gathers once more over their resting place. The wind carries the scent of earth and pine. Somewhere a bell tolls twice, one for Chang, one for Eng, two brothers, one life, forever bound beyond death. For more than a century, the bunker story has existed at the crossroads of myth and documentation. Between the faded pages of court records, birth ledgers, and family Bibles, fragments of their lives still whisper across time, tangible traces of two men who refuse to be defined by their difference. The earliest surviving documents are letters written in uneven English, penned in the brothers' own hand. They are addressed to friends and business partners in Mount Airy and Philadelphia, and they reveal a surprising sophistication. The handwriting differs subtly, Chang's sharp and impatient, Eng's steady and deliberate. One letter from 1847 closes with the line, "We are content in our peace, and though the world may stare, we stare not back." It is a declaration of quiet defiance, penned by men the world once paid to see. Court records from Surrey County list their names among local landholders and taxpayers. Their signatures appear beside deeds of sale, loan notes, and contracts for enslaved laborers, proof that they participated fully in the social and economic structures of their adopted homeland, however flawed those systems may have been. History offers no absolution for such participation, but it does provide context. They sought to belong in a world that measured worth by property and propriety. Family Bibles kept by Adelaide and Sarah contain lists of births and deaths, the ink growing fainter with each generation. The names of their 21 children fill entire pages, carefully dated and annotated. Tucked between the pages, archivists found a lock of hair labeled Chang's son, 1846, preserved in brittle thread. Time has reduced it to dust, but even that dust speaks of a life once lived. In the late 19th century, newspapers from across the United States and Europe printed lengthy obituaries upon the brothers' deaths. Some were sensational, focusing on the medical mystery of their union. Others, like an 1874 editorial in the New York Times, struck a rare note of empathy. They lived together not by choice, but by providence, and in that constraint they built what few men could, a legacy of endurance. Today, those fragments form a mosaic scattered across museums and university archives. Wake Forest University holds the largest collection of bunker artifacts: letters, medical sketches, and the ornate walking cane that once belonged to Chang. The North Carolina Museum of History preserves their family portraits. The oil paint cracked and yellowed, but their expression still unmistakably human. In one portrait, Adelaide's eyes follow her husband even across the frame's edge, as though unwilling to let him drift from her sight. These surviving relics remind us that history is not a spectacle. It is a record of breathing lives, of choices made under pressure, of people seeking dignity in impossible circumstances. The bunker archives do not resolve their contradictions. They simply preserve them, bound as the brothers were, inextricably together for all time. Time has a way of transforming lives into symbols. For Chang and Eng Bunker, what began as a medical anomaly in the early 19th century became a metaphor that outlived them, a reflection of how humanity confronts otherness, dependence, and the boundaries of individuality. Throughout the 20th century, their names reappeared again and again in newspaper columns, traveling exhibitions, medical lectures, and even plays and novels. They became the living archetype of connection and contradiction. Two men sharing one fate. The world coined a term from their homeland, Siamese twins, and their image entered the global lexicon, a word that still echoes whenever science or society encounters what it does not fully understand. But beneath the caricature, deeper interpretations began to surface. Artists and writers found in their stories something universal, not freakish, but profoundly human. Playwrights explored their bond as a meditation on love and autonomy. Novelists saw them as a metaphor for nations divided, for brothers torn between loyalty and identity. In 1999, the musical Chang and Eng premiered in Singapore, turning their lives into a sweeping historical epic, not of horror, but of endurance and grace. It reimagined their connection as both a burden and a sacred tie, the unbreakable truth that no life exists in isolation. In literature, they appeared as both mirror and myth. Mark Twain mentioned them in essays about the American South, fascinated by how two foreign-born men had assimilated into a slave-holding culture. Contemporary poets invoked their names to explore duality, of self and shadow, of freedom and captivity. Even medical ethics scholars cite their case when discussing autonomy and bodily rights, proving that the questions their lives posed have not yet been answered. Their descendants, now numbering over 1,500, live quietly across North Carolina and beyond. Some have chosen to speak publicly, reclaiming their family's history from the sideshow posters and turning it into heritage. Each year, a small reunion takes place near Mount Airy, where great-great-grandchildren gather under a white tent to share stories, photographs, and old newspaper clippings. Beneath those gatherings runs a quiet current of pride, not in the strangeness of their ancestry, but in its resilience. In modern culture, their image has shifted from spectacle to symbol. Artists portray them not as curiosities, but as icons of unity, two souls navigating the boundaries of one existence. In classrooms and museums, they are studied not for their rarity, but for what they reveal about humanity's endless effort to define the self against the other. And perhaps that is their lasting gift, to remind us that connection, even when born of constraint, can still become a form of strength. Chang and Eng's story belongs not to the past, but to the continuum of human empathy, where bodies may be bound, but the spirit remains indivisible. The story of Chang and Eng Bunker does not end beneath the stone that bears their names. It lingers, in the air, in the language, in the questions they left behind. Every generation rediscovers them, not because of what bound their bodies, but because of what freed their spirits. Somewhere in the quiet hills of North Carolina, the morning light still falls on the land they once farmed. The fog lifts slowly over Surry County, revealing the same soft ridges and meadows that witnessed their lives. If you stand there long enough, you can almost hear the rhythm of their footsteps. Two men moving as one, cutting through the mist of history. They were born in a world that refused to believe they could live. They died in a world that could not imagine them apart. Between those two impossibilities, they built a life that remains one of the most extraordinary in human history. Their existence was never a miracle of flesh alone. It was a testament to will. They endured ridicule, distance, disease, and war. They married, fathered children, built homes, and found a way to love in defiance of every expectation. And though they carried a physical bond that could never be undone, their true connection, that quiet, invisible thread of loyalty, ran deeper than the strip of skin that joined them. More than a century later, the world still invokes their names, sometimes carelessly, sometimes reverently as a shorthand for connection. But what the world often forgets is that they were not only joined in body, they were joined in courage, in contradiction, in humanity. Their graves are modest, two names carved into one stone, standing under the shade of an old oak. Visitors often leave flowers, coins, or folded letters written by strangers who somehow see themselves reflected in their story. People who have felt divided within themselves, between duty and desire, fear and hope, stand there and understand, perhaps for the first time, what it means to live intertwined with something you cannot escape, and still find beauty in it. That is the enduring power of the Bunker brothers. They remind us that the human condition is never solitary, that our lives, however separate we may seem, are all linked by invisible seams of circumstance, love, and loss. As the wind moves over their resting place, it carries not sorrow but calm, a peace earned through struggle, a silence that feels like resolution. And when dusk settles over Mount Airy and the sky turns to ash and gold, it is said the mountain holds its breath, as if listening, for the faint echo of two voices, whispering one last time, not Chang, not Eng, but us, more than 150 years after their final breath. Chang and Eng Bunker's story continues to ripple through history, not as a spectacle, but as a mirror held up to the modern world. What began as a medical curiosity in a century of wonder and exploitation has become a case study in humanity, ethics, and endurance. Today, their names appear in textbooks not under oddities, but under medical history and bioethics. Surgeons reference their case when discussing shared organs, conjoined circulation, and the complex boundaries of autonomy. The term Siamese twins, once coined in fascination, has gradually faded from respectful speech, replaced by the more humane phrase, conjoined twins. Even language once used to label them has evolved toward empathy. Universities host symposiums dedicated to their legacy, exploring questions that outlive them. What does individuality mean when two lives share one body? Where does the boundary of self begin and end? And how far will society go to define normal? For every answer, new questions emerge, proving that the Bunker's lives were not an anomaly, but a revelation. Artists, too, continue to return to their image. Painters render them not as curiosities, but as reflections of human connection. Two souls painted with one light source, two shadows cast as one. Photographers reimagine their portraits through modern lenses, turning their story into a symbol of unity and difference. Their likeness has appeared in novels, films, stage productions, and digital art, each one attempting to decipher what it means to live together yet apart. For their descendants, legacy means something quieter. In family homes across North Carolina, framed photographs of Chang and Eng still rest on mantels, not as relics, but as roots. The Bunker name, once whispered, is now spoken with measured pride. Their great-great-grandchildren include teachers, doctors, artists, and public servants. A few have even written books about their ancestry, reclaiming the story from tabloids and turning it into testament. One descendant once said in an interview, "They weren't symbols. They were men. They just happened to carry a story so large the world couldn't stop looking." And perhaps that is the truest form of legacy, when a life becomes a question that every era must answer for itself. In the age of artificial intelligence and genetic design, when humanity once again grapples with what it means to alter the body or merge identities, the echo of the Bunker still resounds. Their story reminds us that connection, even when unwanted or misunderstood, is the foundation of all survival. The brothers have long since returned to dust, but the world continues to orbit their memory. They are no longer flesh, they are metaphor. No longer anomaly, they are history's echo. And in that echo, the heartbeat of two men still sounds, slow, steady, and eternal. In the end, every story becomes a mirror. Time erases faces, softens stone, fades ink, but it never silences the pulse of what once was. The story of Chang and Eng Bunker is no longer theirs alone. It has become a reflection of everyone who has ever wrestled with connection, confinement, or the quiet ache of being known and misunderstood all at once. They were born in a world without mercy and left behind one that barely understood them. Yet between those two worlds, they carved a life with their own hands, stubbornly human, defiantly tender. In their struggle, we find not the strangeness of the body, but the endurance of the spirit. Every generation asks the same question in a different language. What does it mean to belong? To love, even when life refuses to let you live freely? To wake each day bound by something you cannot escape, and still choose to rise? For the Bunker brothers, belonging was not a gift. It was a construction. They built it plank by plank, across continents, across prejudice, across the narrow corridor of flesh that joined them. And in doing so, they taught us something the world still struggles to learn. That unity is not sameness, and separation is not freedom. Theirs is a story without villains, without miracles, only choices, only consequence, and perhaps that's why it endures. Because within their impossible lives, we glimpse our own divided hearts, the parts that cling to others, the parts that long to be free. Somewhere in Surrey County, the dawn light still touches their shared headstone. The air hums softly with cicadas, the soil breathes with the rhythm of time. Their names, Chang and Eng, carved side by side, worn but not forgotten. Visitors come and go, leaving flowers, coins, or just a moment of silence. The earth accepts it all. Maybe that's how every story ends, not in revelation, but in return, back to the ground, back to the breath, back to the stillness that holds everything together. For as long as people remember them, the brothers remain more than men. They are the quiet proof that connection, no matter how imperfect, is what keeps the world alive. And when the final words fade and the film of history rolls to black, only one thing lingers, the echo of two hearts beating in one rhythm, still somewhere out there, beneath the weight of time. Not curiosity, not legend, just life, bound, enduring, and human.